Okay, so here's what I decided to do today. Even though this setting of videos have been and still are, very much are, what I'm looking to do with these videos is continue to do what I have been doing, and that is the format of receiving your emails, questions, comments, concerns, confusion, intimidation stuff and flying, whatever it might be. I receive a slew of emails. I mean, IFR, VFR, which is amazing. Even though this will continue to be that, every once in a while, there will be a trend in the types of emails that I receive and from the types of people I receive them from, which will sort of prompt me. It will cause me to decide to change this format up a little bit and make something different every once in a while, just as I always say, to answer to that trend of email. So if there's 20 people emailing me about center of gravity questions, I might knock out a video talking about center of gravity. So what happened here in the recent past, very interestingly, you would say, is I've been receiving an unusual amount of emails from both flight instructors, but more so from CFI candidates. So these are people who are in school, who are in the process of studying for and getting their CFI. Always appreciate your emails. Good on you guys, gals. I think everyone, if they can, should become a CFI. If anything, as I always say, you'll get lower insurance rates on your airplane. So it's worth it from that standpoint, even if you're not planning on teaching. And it'll make you a better pilot, as always. But what happened in the recent past is just a bunch of emails from CFIs and from CFI candidates. Hey, I'm making my lesson plan. I'm this. They're asking about a slew of things. So what I decided to do is I decided to turn the camera on, and rather than make a video answering every single question individually, which I probably will at some point if and when I find the time. I just don't have the time of the day to answer all the emails, which is why I always say I try and answer and discuss the topics that touch the most amount of emails. That way I could knock out a bunch of people's questions with just one video. But hopefully one day I'll have the time to literally answer all the emails on video, which seem to help people. But what I decided to do with all these CFIs emailing me and talking about different topics and stuff, what I realized is I realized the trend. I realized the pattern. And the pattern is that, and I experienced this myself too, which is why maybe it stuck out to me as much as it did. And the pattern I found by just reading these emails from CFI candidates is how easy it is for CFI candidates, including myself when I was going through it, to fall into what I call the fantasy bookland, right? There's this, you're in a controlled training environment when you're getting your CFI. Books, you're learning about learning, you're learning about teaching, you're learning about everything, which is great. I think it's a phenomenal foundation. But one thing you're not getting, and again, maybe you can't get in that type of controlled environment, is real world. Like, to ask any CFI out there, until you've gone out there and sat in an airplane with a real, true, brand new student who has no clue how you taxi this thing. Until that happens, it's all pretend, right? You're just flying with CFIs at your school who probably their knowledge might even intimidate you. And here you are, you need to teach them stuff and you need to answer. So it's almost like a movie set. It's all scripted. And I say this line and you say that line. And then I ask you this question. So it's very difficult, unless, of course, you're someone who realizes this. If you're in CFI training, if you right now are in school and you're going through the process and you quickly realized this is not real world and I want to prepare myself for real world. And what you did is you kind of maybe approached other private pilots in your school, if it's a big enough school, and maybe asked them if you could teach them stuff. Unless you've done that, your interaction with a human being who has truly limited knowledge has probably been close to zero. So it's up to you. The first thing I'll say is it's up to you to go out there and seek out these people who are open to hearing you teach them stuff and actually seeing how much of what you tell them sticks and how much of it doesn't stick, because that's your feedback. If you pull someone aside If there's a private pilot in your school who started 2 weeks ago, and you pull them aside and you teach them about carburetors, or you teach them about whatever it is, traffic patterns, and at the end of it, you ask some questions just to see what stuck and didn't. It's very easy. You just say, hey, so we just discussed blah, blah, blah. What do you call the traffic pattern leg that parallels the runway? If they can't answer that, that is feedback to you that maybe the way you went about teaching traffic pattern legs was lacking, right? Maybe you taught it well, but you left certain pieces out that would have them, maybe know what you call that leg or whatever it might be. But just by asking a few questions, you get that feedback. And that feedback is very important. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off track. What I decided to do is turn the camera on, and having received all these emails from CFI candidates, I realized the trend is this, or the pattern is this. Easy to fall into the Fantasyland book world, using all these terms that the FAA wants you to use, blah, 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 blah. So here's what I want to do. I want for a moment, if anything, just for the length of this video, if you're a CFI candidate or if you're thinking of getting your CFI, I want you for just the next few minutes, throw all the books out the window. Just throw them all out the window mentally. Don't burn your books, but just mentally throw the books away. Throw the specific lingo and language and words that you've been asked to use away. Okay, just kind of let's get back to who you are for a second. You're a good person. You're someone who has probably more knowledge than you give yourself the credit for. And what I want to do for the next few minutes, and the title of this video says it all, but I decided to call it 5 questions you should be able to answer as a CFI candidate. And I think this will be helpful because I thought for a while now, again, obviously there's 100 questions that students ask on a regular basis, but to keep this video shorter rather than longer and to kind of convey to you the real world stuff that you might come across. There's probably one question in here that's less real world, but still I think it's good knowledge for you to have, so I included it. But all the rest are like real world questions that your student will guarantee ask you if they're someone who has any sense of initiative and ownership of their training. They'll realize it and they'll ask you. And when they do, I want to make sure that you have a great answer to give them because you owe them a good answer. They're paying you for your expertise to run things by you. They trust you, right? For those of you who are not even becoming CFIs but are private pilots watching this, you know how you look up to your instructor. Hopefully you do, if it's a good relationship. So it's a big thing. And for those of you who are becoming CFIs, you know this as well. You've been through the process. So it's a very strong it's full of trust. It has to be. It's a relationship filled with trust. And so we have to be able as CFIs to provide our students not with an answer, but with a good answer, with an answer that has substance and knowledge behind it. And oftentimes what I've found, especially reading through these emails, is how again and again CFI candidates fall into, and again, I'm not faulting anyone, it's probably just the way things happen, but falling into this fantasy book specific FAA terms land, and in the process just almost become robotic and don't become human beings who connect with their students and are able to actually explain things in simple terms that the student could hear and go, wow, that's amazing. I could have thought of that. Like, that's the goal, right? As a CFI, the more answers you could give your student to where their reaction is, oh yeah, that's it. That's all there is to it. Whoa, that's crazy. I thought it was way more complicated. Like, the more reactions, like the more this type of reactions that you get, the more onto it you probably are. And that's the goal. The goal is to not only answer your student's question, but also in that process, continually, however you say it, prove to your student that none of these things are complex and complicated as much as they're just new. It's just unfamiliar material to the student. So by making it from unfamiliar to familiar, now your student goes, oh wow, It's not hard. It makes perfect sense. That's the goal, right? The goal is not for your student to walk away half scratching their head going, oh, I'm not sure. Like, and again, of course it will happen. I'm just drawing the goal here. Just to give you kind of an idea, that's the goal. You want to simplify the process, and you want to show, and your student is looking to you to do that. No one else would do it for your student. Okay, unless you, of course, as you should, you teach your student how to do it for themselves. So if you're a really good CFI, what you'll do is you'll encourage and you'll show your student how they could demystify this unfamiliar territory on their own time at home. And if you don't do that, they don't know it. Just like a kid, if you don't tell the kid something, they probably don't know it unless they learn it someplace else. But that's just the reality of learning. So, okay. So to keep it on point here, again, there's so many areas that I could get talking here, but what I want to do is just keep this relatively shorter than longer. Like I said, 5 questions you should be able to answer as a CFI candidate, okay? And that's what the title of this video will be. So before I run into the 5 questions, I'll say this. If you right now can't answer these questions or can't answer them simply, and by simply I mean a whiteboard, a marker, and about 2 minutes, okay? Or a minute and a half. Like, that's kind of a good gauger as to how much ownership and how much do you really understand the material and knowledge. Because really all these questions could be answered in about definitely less than 5 minutes. I'm going with 2 minutes, right? We're just looking for a quick to the point answer. Now, that doesn't mean you can't expand on any one of these for an hour. Of course, I can, you can, we of course we can. But just to prove to yourself that you could answer these things simply, accurately, to the point, in a way that's easy to understand, I want you to test this on yourself. Try yourself. So back to the video format I discussed in the beginning. The reason this format is different is because what I'm going to do here is really just present you with the questions. I'm not going to give you the answers here. If people want specific answers, again, as always, feel free to email me with your specific question, and as I have the time and enough interest on that topic, I'm happy to cover it here. But the goal of this video is I want to present you with 5 questions that I, after years of doing this, have found that these are things that come up from students in the real world. Okay, and remember, students, before they ask you a question, they don't sit there and go, is the question I'm going to ask my instructor included in those big fat books they've been studying, or is it included in their lesson plans that they have? They don't do that. They don't even know what a lesson plan is. When a student asks an instructor a question, they just do it because they're curious. And these curiosity points come up all the time throughout training. So what I wrote here is 5 questions that I found come up a lot and could be answered very simply. They're not complicated. But many CFIs, when asked these questions, almost are intimidated or thrown off, specifically CFI candidates, because again, you've been held to only speak the terms in the books, okay? And sometimes that's limiting because it constricts your ability to just think freely. So for the next few minutes in this video, throw the books out the window in an imaginary way and just be yourself for a minute. And when I ask these questions, write them down. And see if you can answer these questions. And if you can't, I urge you to get out there and spend whatever amount of time you need to spend to really figure out for yourself, what are you going to tell your student when your student asks you these questions, or a variation of this question. So here we go. Okay, question number 1. And I won't read these verbatim. I just wrote these to kind of I wrote this over time thinking about it, but I'm just looking at this, referencing this to make sure that I'm getting what I want to get in there right. So, okay, question number 1 has to do with crosswinds. And the reason I started with crosswinds is because on most landings and takeoff, but specifically we'll talk about landings here. On most landings, there'll probably be some amount of crosswind. Hopefully it won't always be a direct 20 knot crosswind, but there'll be a little bit, meaning the airplane will to some degree point either to the right or left of the extended center line of the runway when you show up to land. So here we go. The question is this. It's a 2-part question. Part number 1, why is it that when we fly an approach to a runway with a crosswind, the airplane always seems to point into the, like towards the direction from which the wind is coming from. Okay. So for example, if we're showing up, shooting an approach to a runway and we have a right crosswind, the student might tell you, hey, this might be a crazy question, but it seems to me like every time we come into land with a right crosswind, we're kind of pointing to the right. We're not pointing to the runway. Okay. Or if we're coming into land with a left crosswind, we're pointing to the left. We're not pointing to the runway. So that's part one of the question. Your student might ask you this. Hopefully they will. If they're, again, like I said, they're engaged and they see what's going on. Again, they won't do this week one because they're so busy. They're so narrowly focused in on different things. But as their horizons expand and they're able to relax, they might realize these things and they will ask you because you're their flight instructor. So that's part one of the question. Why does the airplane seem to always point into the wind from where the wind's coming from? Excellent. Or if they're unable to ask into the wind, they might just say, hey, why when there's winds or a crosswind, the plane just seems to point sideways? Or they might even not connect it with crosswinds. They might just say, why is my plane pointing sideways? Whatever it is, some variation of this question. That's part number one. Part number two of the question, same question, part number two is this. With a right crosswind, I'm using right for the sake of this example. You could use left, it doesn't really matter. With a right crosswind, let's assume there's a 10-knot straight right crosswind. In order for us to not sideload when we touch down, which flight control inputs will we need on touchdown, during touchdown, in order to land straight with the runway and on center line? Okay, so your student, after not messing up, but after just completely sideloading a plane a few times, might become curious. But again, hopefully you'll teach it to them even before they do that. But let's assume we didn't, and you ask them, and they come to you and they say, hey, how do I figure this thing out? So that's the question. The question is, with a right crosswind, which flight control inputs do we need during touchdown in order to not sideload, to land straight parallel with the runway and on center line? Okay, so that's question number one. Why is the plane pointing towards the wind on final with a crosswind? And part two is, what flight control inputs do we need on touchdown in order to not sideload the airplane? All right, question number two. And like I said before, this question is probably the only one here that's the least real world, and it's more books knowledge stuff. But again, nonetheless, very important for you, especially as a CFI, to know. And just a little sip of coffee here. For those of you who know me, love coffee. And this will give you time to think about the question. Why does the airplane point towards the wind? And what flight control inputs do we need when we touch down? Look at that. And again, you might be able right now to just answer these very simply, and that's good. If you hear these questions and you go, what's he talking about? Like, does he think he's talking to a child? Like, oh, what's he doing? I'm turning this video off. He's disrespecting me. If you feel that, that's good. You should tap yourself on the back, right? If you're able to go ahead and take these questions and write it on a whiteboard and just explain it simply to someone and they understand it. And again, the higher goal from just having them understand it is to have them walk away going, oh my gosh, this is so simple, awesome, amazing. I never thought of that. That's the goal, right? That's the feedback you're looking for as a CFI. Don't just be happy with, I answered their question. Don't just be satisfied with, I provided them with an answer. That's what average CFIs do. What you want to do is you want to shoot for a standard to where when you answer a student's question, they get excited by realizing, dang, this is simpler than I thought. That's pretty cool. And what that does is it lowers the intimidation factor of the entire training process. And then next time you do it again, maybe in a week you do it again with something else. And they go, wow. And subconsciously they go, wow, my CFI is just, he's on a roll, he or she are on a roll of proving how simple this flying thing really could be. And that's a good thing. That's what we want to do with students. So don't just be satisfied with, they asked a question, I give them an answer. Okay? Sometimes, obviously, the right thing to do is to have them look the answer up. I'm not getting into all that. But I'm saying when you're providing an answer to your student, aim to also in that process prove to them how simple this whole thing could be and how really it's not complex. It's just new. I always say it's just new, it's just unfamiliar, but it's not hard. There's a difference. It's a whole topic for another video. But here we go. Question number 1, write it down, watch this video 20 times. That's question number 1. It's a 2-parter. Question number 2 is also a 2-parter. Question number 2 has to do with center of gravity, CG, okay? Again, I chose this specific one because the CG leads into many other discussions and potential questions, which hopefully you're taking the time to just learn the effects of CG on an airplane and how that works. But here we go. Question number 2 goes like this. Which CG placement results in a lower controllability, meaning less authority on my flight controls? So me as the pilot, I could have an aft CG. I could load the airplane with a bunch of stuff towards the back and have an aft CG, or I could have a forward CG. Which placement of my CG leaves me, the pilot, with lower, worse controllability? I have less authority, flight control authority. Okay, that's part 1 of the question. Part 2 of the question is why? So once you figure out which CG placement leaves me with a lower, worse, bad, less controllability, the next thing I want you to be able to talk about and explain simply to someone, you might need a whiteboard for this, but again, it's not complicated. Why is it that CG placement, which you'll figure out, results in less flight control authority? Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Write that down. That's the next question. Maybe your commercial students, you'll get this more from your commercial students because you dive a little deeper into effects of forward and aft CG in commercial than you do in private. But nonetheless, if you have a very engaged private student who's very eager to learn everything they can about airplanes, again, you're their instructor and they'll come to you and they expect you to know. You owe it to your student to know the answer to these things, and you owe it to them to know the answer in a simple way that they can understand. Because one of the things you learn as an instructor is that there's a big difference between knowing something, saying something, and then there's a whole other level, and that is saying something to someone who's on a completely different playing field than you, okay? It's easy for you to speak airplane speak with your other CFI candidate friends at school. Very easy. You're both relatively in the same ballpark as far as knowledge, right? You're in the same program. You maybe started flight school the same day together, especially if you're doing a fast track. Completely different animal to speak airplane speak to someone who's down here, okay? Who's on a completely different planet as far as all these airplane stuff are concerned. So again, that's another something that you'll realize very quickly in the real world. And what I'm trying to do here is just kind of give you a heads up. I'm trying to prepare you and tell you that the real world, the books are great, and FAA terms are wonderful. Everything's very, very sweet and great and excellent, and you'll pass your check and it'll be phenomenal. But again, what we're shooting for on the other side of all this is how could you be the best CFI that you possibly can for every single one of your students. You owe it to them. You owe it to them. So that's why I'm constantly talking about the standards, right? Don't just be satisfied with what I said before with just providing an answer, but actually look to prove to your student how simple these things could be. Okay, I'm getting off on tangents, but we're moving along. We're already up to 3. So you got the 2 first questions. Question number 3, again, very real world. Just like the first one, this also has to do with landings. Landings are such a big part of our flying career for the rest of your life, right? If you're every single flight you're going to take from now till the last flight you take will involve a landing. Hopefully, every single one of your landings will be controlled landings with engine power onto a specified point that you actually intend on landing on. But even if it's not, even if it's into a field after losing an engine, it's still hopefully going to be a landing. It is a landing, and it will be controlled, and everyone will walk away safely. But landings are a giant part of this flying thing, so which is why probably this third question also has to do with landings. So it goes like this. The third one is this. It has to do with aiming versus touchdown point. So the aiming versus touchdown point. Okay? And I wrote a few things here. The first thing a student of yours might ask, again, not knowing anything about aiming and touchdown, maybe they've never heard those terms before. What they will ask is, whoa, why did we just float that much down the runway? Okay, this is a very real question that your student might ask you. Okay, they don't know anything. All they're doing is they're coming into land and they're holding the plane off like you taught them. And all of a sudden, they're floating halfway down the runway. Okay, and maybe they're floating so much it even caught you off guard. Nonetheless, they turn to you there, maybe in the classroom after, whatever it might be, and they say, why did we float that much? That was more float than I expected or than I'm used to. That's the first real world question I'll present you with. What do you say, right? What do you answer? Now again, I'm trying very hard to not answer these questions. I just want to provide you with the question, not the answer. But there's a few possibilities here, right? There's a few things that could have happened that caused or could cause potentially any plane to float. So I want you to start thinking, what are those things and what are you going to tell your student when they ask you that question? Now, the opposite is true too. What if your student is coming in, they're expecting to float, but bam, they just land. They just land way shorter than they thought. And they turn to you and they say, why did that happen, right? What are you going to tell your student? Again, this is real world stuff that you are guaranteed to get from your student if your student is taking ownership of their training and is engaged and actually wants to know and learn all these things. Some students don't, but most likely your student, or at least some of them, will ask you these questions. So those are some simple questions that you'll probably get about floating and not floating. But here's specifically what I want you to think about as far as the aiming and touchdown points are concerned. Why is it important? I want you to answer this to friends of yours or private pilots, whoever it might be, or to yourself. The first question is this: why is understanding aiming versus touchdown point important at all? Like, how would not understanding that concept affect my flying? Okay, that's one question that you should toil with as a CFI candidate, right? Just why is it important? Like, what is it about the aiming and touchdown point? Like, what's going on there? Like, what is all that about? And once you figure that out, the next one is, how can we in the airplane as the pilots, by having a good understanding of aiming and touchdown points, how could we now go and control and adjust the distance between our aiming and touchdown point? What are some ways that we could go about doing that? Okay. So again, why is aiming and touchdown points important? Right? What are they? What do they do? Why is it important and helpful to know that? And then once we figure that out, I want you to be able to talk simply and explain, how could we, the pilots, go about shrinking or increasing the distance between the aiming and the touchdown point? Again, probably a whiteboard could be helpful, but you don't need more than 2 minutes to answer this question. So just aim for simple, aim for an answer that will cause your student to go, whoa, that's cool. That's awesome. I get it. That's the goal. Okay, so that's question number 3. Question number 4, we're moving along. This is good. Question number 4 has to do with altimeters. Again, you're probably guaranteed to get this from one of your students, if not all of them, if they're paying attention. And it goes like this: why do we constantly update the altimeter setting in the altimeter? Like, what is that? Like, what are we doing? Right? That's probably something you're going to get from your student. Again, not on week one. Week one, they're just too busy listening to you and doing everything, and they're not even thinking. Not because they're less smart people, just because, again, when you're learning something new at first, you're so laser focused, you don't even, right? But once a week or two go by, and they're able to relax, and they're able to breathe, and they're able to look out and enjoy the flight, and then an altimeter setting shows up, a new one, and they plug it in, they might turn to you and go, hey, why do we do this every time? Like, what are we doing, right? So that's question number 1. What are you going to tell your student, right? So again, in flight instructor school and throughout your training, you really learned a lot about how altimeters work. But what I'm trying to push you to do here is to get on the whiteboard and speak out loud why we plug in an altimeter setting into the altimeter every 15 or so minutes. Like, that's it. That's as real world as it gets. When your student asks you that question, what are you going to tell them? Okay, so that's that. And the second part to the question is, what type of altitude does our altimeter show us? Meaning, is it AGL? Is it MSL? Is it pressure altitude? Is it like what this number on the altimeter? That's the height above what, right? A student might ask you that question, especially once you start teaching them about AGL and MSL. Maybe you get into pressure, density, altitude, right? Maybe a student might think it's density altitude. So what altitude does your altimeter read? It's very simple. It's a simple question, but it's one you might get from a student. So again, don't aim to just answer, but aim to inspire. So don't just say, I'll give you the answer. Don't just say, oh, it's MSL, it's height above sea level. But explain in that, right? You could tie that into the first part of the question. Why is it that we plug in these updated altimeter settings as we fly along? So you could talk about all that. But again, these are real stuff that you'll get from students out there. So before you head out on the line and start teaching people, take 2 minutes with a whiteboard and just try and answer these questions. I always say the best way to get through CFI training is the more questions you remember you had when you first started out flying. What I want you to do is write them on a whiteboard, and then you answer your questions in about 2 minutes or less, okay? Because really, there's so many stuff in your head, memories of topics that you struggled with when you first started. Why not try and answer your own questions in a simple form now that you're becoming a CFI? Few CFIs do this, but I think it's a very, very powerful way of and it's cool. It's like a full circle. It's like at one point I was struggling, and now I'm the one answering my own questions in a simple way, and it really shows you how far you've come. So I think don't downplay that. Don't disregard that. Okay. Little more coffee, and then we're on to our fifth question. The fifth question has nothing to do with airplanes specifically, and this is why I left it for the fifth one. The fifth one has to do with flight training in general. The fifth one has to do with, again, all these questions are questions you'll most likely get. If there's one I had to sign a lot of money on and bet that you would get, it's the fifth one. I've gotten it from every single one of my students, and it's actually a question that many students across the country struggle with because they're just not sure. So guess who they will turn to? Their instructor. And when they turn to you, we want to make sure that we have a good answer for our students, and not just an answer that is going to serve us or the school, and if you're involved in such a school, oh boy, that's no bueno. That's a video for another time. But really what we want to do is provide our student with an answer to this question, which I'll mention here once I sip my coffee, in a way that will allow them to make the best decision. And to not only know that you have them in mind first, right? It's all about the student. They're paying you to serve them as a CFI. So not only will they know that you're serving them, but they'll actually feel it, and they'll know it, and they'll walk around with that feeling that my CFI has my best interest in mind. So little coffee and we'll jump into it. Amazing. Okay, and again, these questions, not complicated. In fact, I know you thought about and learned the topics to all these questions many times. If you're now a CFI candidate, you've been through commercial, you've been through private. Not complicated. What might be new to you and interesting and take a few times getting used to is just, like I said before, speaking these things to someone who's on a completely different level than you. Because what you're probably doing as most CFI candidates, especially if you're in a big program with other people, is you're spending your afternoons chatting with your CFI candidate buddies who are in the same exact level. So the issue there is if you say something that a private might not understand, guess what? Your CFI buddy goes, oh yeah, makes perfect sense. They get it, right? Because they know a lot. And what happens is you don't get that feedback of your gaps. You don't get the feedback of maybe you're not breaking something down simply enough. So you got to talk with people who know very little about this. Okay, question number 5 goes like this. Question number 5 goes like this. Your student will turn to you one day. Maybe they'll do this before you even start flying. Doesn't matter when they do this. I just want to make sure you are ready to provide them with what you owe them. And what you owe them is a great answer, an answer that we'll talk about this in a second. But the question goes like this. They'll turn to you and they'll say this: how often should we be flying? Okay. And if you're a CFI out there, and if you've never received this question, you're a special person. I mean, it's just the odds are very low. But if you're a CFI watching this, you've probably received this from every one of your students. And I'll go even further to say this. If you have a student who doesn't ask this question, it should be a topic that you bring up and discuss with your student. That's how important this topic is. So your student will turn to you one day and say, how often should we fly together? Because the thing about flight training is it might sometimes seem like all we're dealing with is just a session here, a session there. We're flying, right? And it's easy to forget as a CFI, because it's been a while since we were students ourselves. It's easy to forget the sacrifices and the shifting of the entire life of the student that they do. I'm not even talking about someone who's married with kids. Like, that's a whole other level of sacrifices. I'm talking about just anyone who single, has a job, maybe a girlfriend, maybe a boyfriend, whatever it might be. The shifting of things that they have to do in order to fit this flight training in is tremendous. It's an unbelievable commitment, especially if there's someone who's serious about it, who's hitting it on a regular basis, who's not letting life get in their way of flight training. They're letting life know that we're flight training right now, and life will hold on for just a little bit until we're done flight training. Like, some students are like that. Other students are less like that. But nonetheless, it's a big shift. It's a big commitment. Now, if you're married with kids, it's a whole other level. So it's easy sometimes to forget as a CFI that your student is dealing with shifting all this life around to fit these sessions in, okay? So when they ask, how often should we fly together? Sure, it has a lot to do with, well, what would enable them to learn the best and to have things stick the best. But it also, remember, has a lot to do with other stuff. And other stuff has to do with money, shifting things around, right? Maybe they could find a babysitter for their child 2 days a week, but if you tell them we need to fly 5 days a week, they might have the money for the flight training, but now they're stuck with figuring out where my kid will be for 3 other days. So there's a lot going on there, right? Money. And for some, it's everything. It's money, it's time, it's babysitter, it's dog, it's girlfriend, it's boyfriend, whatever it might be. So there's a lot going on there. So that's why this is so important to, when a student asks you how often should we fly together, you have a really good substantive, I hope that's the word, answer. And an answer with your student in mind, with your student first, because we are here to serve our students. Our students don't show up to the flight session to serve us. My student pays me money in order for me to provide my services, and I am serving my student with my services, okay? Let's not get that order of things forgotten or messed up or mixed up, right? I am here to serve my students' needs. And every single one of your students will have different needs. So don't fall into that pit of, I'm just a CFI, and if one student doesn't fit my mold, then they're good for nothing. No, it doesn't work that way. You're as a CFI, you're expected to work with multiple personalities, multiple people who have different lifestyles. So let's not forget who's here to serve who. So we are here as CFIs to serve the student. So when the student asks us, how often should we fly together? We're here to serve them, and we owe them a good answer. We owe them an answer with substance, and that will allow them to make the best decision for them. So the first thing I will say about this is that there's no one answer fits all. So don't go to a whiteboard and try and answer this question, because that's the reason I'm bringing this up. There's no one answer fits all. You will have a student who flying twice a week is the best thing they could possibly do, and then you might have another student who flying 3 times a week is the best thing they could do, and another student who flying 4 times a week is the best thing they could do. Now, generally speaking, I have a very hard time seeing a situation where flying either once or 5 times a week could be the best thing someone could do. At those edges of the spectrum, it just becomes a waste of money and a waste of time. If you're doing more than four is a lot too, but if you're doing more than four, now they're starting to show up. They're fried. I mean, think of the time they have now to spend at home. That shrinks because they're busy with you. And so it becomes counterintuitive. If you do fly just once a week, that's probably too little, especially when someone's starting out, right? Because when you're starting out, you're spending about a quarter of every session playing catch up. Hey, remember we talked about how to taxi with rudder last time? Remember that? Hey, show me that again. Oh, there you go. There's center line. Okay. And you're spending a good number of minutes just playing catch up, because at the end of the last session, they taxied perfectly. And then they show up this next one and they start moving the ailerons, the yoke. And you go, hey, remember how we taxi? Oh yeah, we use our feet. So you could see it's about a quarter of every single thing you do on that session requires catch up. And that's normal. That's just how we operate as humans. Something is brand new to us, we need a little catch up. As time goes on, the catch up periods shrink to the point where now they show up and we kickstart the next session pretty much right where we left off on the last one. But that's where the proficiency is quite high, towards the middle of training or the end of training. But in the beginning, once a week, also a waste of money for different reasons. So the thing I want to leave you with this: how often should you fly together? When your student asks you this question, always, first of all, remember, I'm here to serve my student. I'm here to serve my student's needs. I'm not here to serve my own needs. I'm not here to serve my flight school's needs. Obviously, you are there to serve your need. Like, you're paying your bills. This is your job, and you should take pride in what you do. And you're there to serve your needs in that sense. But we're here to serve my student's needs, and we're here to do whatever my student needs in order to succeed to the best of their ability. So if your specific student wants to fly 3 times a week and you are finding that it's too much, meaning it's just overkill, you owe it to your student to share that with them and to say, hey, let's do twice a week. Maybe we could pick it up to 3 once we're more proficient. Or on the flip side of things, maybe your student wants to fly once or twice a week and you're realizing, you know what? Maybe they need 3 times a week. You owe that perspective to your student. Now, by owe it to them and by giving it to them, I'm not saying we should shove it down their throat and force anyone to do anything. Because remember, they just asked us a question for our opinion. All we owe them is our honest answer. And as a CFI, you have what's called the gift of perspective, right? You, unlike them, sat and will sit around many people who are learning how to master this thing called flying. So over the years or over the months, you pick up what works, what doesn't work, what works for these types of people, what doesn't work for these types of people. And so when your student comes to you and asks you this question, you have a perspective, you have a leg up on them in terms of perspective. You've seen it amongst other people, so now you could give them a good educated answer. But that doesn't mean we're forcing or making anyone do anything. Okay, we're all adults. We could share with our students what we think is best. If our student says, I agree, I like it, and they make the sacrifices to make it happen, excellent. If our student says, I hear ya, give me 2 weeks to work on this, I'm trying to shift some stuff in my life, excellent. If they hear you and you go, I appreciate it, but let's stick with flying once a week, excellent. Your training might take 1.5 years or 2 years. Again, it's all up, you're an adult, it's all up to your student. But what we owe them is a good answer that gives them the ability to do their homework and think about things and really come up with a game plan and a decision that works for them. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for a cut, dry answer of here's how many times my flight school wants to charge you a week, right? That's not, and students feel that. So that's not the goal. We are here to serve our student. The student in the plane is your boss. How about that? Did you ever think about this? The student in your plane is your boss, right? We often, when we work at a flight school, we think, oh, our boss is in the office. Our boss is at home right now on the beach, enjoying their life while I'm making the money. Sure, they're your boss. You know who else is your boss? You know who is your boss's boss? Your student. Your student sitting next to you who can't taxi an airplane straight is your boss's boss, and therefore your boss, okay? You are there to serve them. Think about this. Think about this. I hope your school teaches you these things in CFI training. Your student is your boss. They're paying, their money allows you to be there and pay your bills, and allows your boss to be there and your school to be there. Your student is your boss. Don't forget that. Don't forget that. Treat them with respect. Show up to serve. Strive to give them answers that inspire them, that leave them feeling, whoa, this is not nearly as complicated as I thought before I asked the question. And you never know. You might have students who end up becoming CFIs because they appreciate and were so inspired from your or their time with you, where without you, they probably would never become a CFI, would never be something that would appeal to them. So you never know the degree to which you are able to inspire people if you remember what we talked about in this video, and if you always show up to serve and remember your place, your student's place. It's so easy to lose sight of who's in charge. There shouldn't even be in charge, but just remember, your student is your boss. Your student is your boss's boss. They're paying you for your expertise, and you owe it to them. You owe it to them to do your very best every single time you guys interact and every single time you meet. So with that, I know this last question, there's no, like I said, there's no black and white answer, but I'm presenting it here because I want you to take it and think about it. How are you going to handle a student who's going to ask you how many times you guys should fly? And have ready a list to share with them the pros and the cons of flying more versus flying less every week. Okay? But like I said before, when discussing this with a student, you always have to take into account the rest of their life. Ask questions. Say, hey, before we even go to what's good for learning, what's your life looking like? Like, what are you able to, maybe 3 flights a week is the best for learning, but you can only spend 2 because you have 4 kids at home and no babysitter and you're tight on funds, right? So you got to take an interest in what's going on in that person's life when discussing this. But the answer to the last question is that there's no answer. There's only a good discussion to be had between instructor and students, and you owe that to your student. And if they don't bring it up, if they don't ask that question, you bring it up and try and figure out how can we tailor this game plan in a way that works best for you. Again, remember, we're showing up to serve. How can this work best for you? And they'll appreciate that. I promise you they'll appreciate that. So there we have it. What did I title this? The five questions you should be able to answer as a CFI candidate. Again, like I said in the beginning, there's 1,000 questions you should be able to answer. And there's probably more than 1,000 questions you should be able to answer more simply than you are answering them right now. And that will come with time, right? Always try and strive for simple, easy. Because like I said, part of what you want your student to walk away with is not only the answer, but also a feeling of, whoa, this airplane stuff is not that complex, right? That's the goal. That if we could have more people on the planet thinking that, amazing. Flight training will be more fun. It'll be more relaxed, right? So don't just strive to answer the question. Answer it and leave your student inspired. And guess what? That student might tell themselves, now I want to be able to inspire my students, and then they'll get their CFI, or they'll get their instrument, they'll get their commercial, and then they'll get their CFI. But that's that. That's what we have time for this one. This probably did go over the amount of time I wanted this video to go over, but again, there's so many things to talk about and discuss when it comes to the CFI world. So if this video is a little longer than usual, bear with me. But my goal is but with the sheer number of emails from CFI candidates, I figured this could be helpful. So hope this helps. Hope this resonates. And I hope you're able to not only answer the questions I asked simply, even though I want you to answer these questions simply because these, again, guaranteed your students will ask. But think back to when you were a private. What are some topics you were intimidated by or struggled with? And answer your old self in a simple way. It's a pretty cool, weird circle thing. So you'll feel great. And run through those things. And then when you run out of stuff, Ask your CFI candidate friends, hey, Mike, Rachel, what topics did you guys struggle with when you were in private? Like, what intimidated you? And they might give you stuff that you didn't struggle with at all, and then try and answer their stuff simply. It's the best exercise you could do when you're becoming a CFI for the real world. Because again, remember, the biggest downside to CFI training is it's not real world. We could try and get as much real world parts and pieces into it by, again, like I said, pulling a private student aside and teaching them blah, blah, blah. But until you do it, you don't do it. You didn't do it. It's like a movie, scripted. Okay? So fine, that's the process. We have to deal with what we have to deal with. But what I'm saying, on your own time, on your own, there's nowhere in the FARs does it say you can't challenge yourself to answer these questions simply, and to answer any other topic simply, and to be ready and prepared to provide your student with an amazing, amazing, insightful, enlightening, and an answer that will inspire them and prove to them how this flight training is not only simple, but fun and enjoyable and much, much easier to understand than maybe they walked into this thinking. So, hope this video was helpful, and until next time, fly safe, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye. Hey guys, it's Yoel. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it answered some of your questions, confusion, whatever it might be, that I was able to help you in your own flight training journey. If you did enjoy the video and you did find it helpful, I would appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel and like the video. What that does with the YouTube algorithm is it kind of lets the AI way of letting YouTube know that there's some interest here and there's some helpful information for others, and that way YouTube will share this with other students or people who are going through flight training just like you. So if you do those things, it always helps, and I do appreciate it. Secondly, if you also have a topic, a question, a topic, a concern, confusion, whatever it might be, that you want me to talk about on these videos here, go ahead and email me. There's an email in the description of this video below. So if you click on the description of the video, you'll see an email. Email that email with your question or topic, whatever it is you want me to talk about. And in the subject line of the email, write Ask Yoel, because this series is what I call Ask Yoel. So that way when the emails come in, we're able to separate them and know that your email is a topic you want me to discuss on these videos. Anyhow, hope it was helpful, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Take care.